Hi Simon, thanks for the footage. Sorry for the delay in getting this across to you. Had a busy weekend and then I've had a few dramas with this software that's been updated. So anyway, just to add some detail to the imagery that I sent across to you, watching you from P1 to P2, and we touched on this in the back and forth on WhatsApp the other day. The move from 1 to 2 is more of a lifting of the trail shoulder as opposed to a lowering of the lead shoulder. There is also next to no loading of accumulator 2, the wrists. Now you mentioned accumulator 1. Your tendency from, certainly from the first time I saw you, and judging by your sort of comments, it's an historical one, is to pull the right elbow this way. That's just your way of starting the backswing. That could be because of a history of maybe trying to keep the club quote unquote in front of you. Really difficult to tell. It's a feel thing, obviously. But you tend to sort of, it's like a different loading pattern, isn't it? There's so many ways of getting the club to P2. P2 ultimately is just a definitive position in the swing where the shaft hits parallel with the ground. So what I'd like to see you do, rather than pulling up with the right arm, for want of a better description, which in turn raises the club, we've got to look at how we start the club's ascent. You notice from down the line that as you pull up with the right shoulder, in order to do that, the right leg's got to straighten a little bit too much as well, so those two things are linked. Just a quickie at P1, I've put the white lines on the face on. You might want to look at that sort of axis tilt stroke side bend and the eye line. You look like you're looking in a little bit with the head, and certainly you'd want to see your upper centre aligned with or just a touch behind the lower centre. So just push that pelvis forward a little bit, and that'll start to assist in regards to your question about extra hip slide during the downswing. I've put a green line on there, I'll come to that later. That relates more to that move in transition, or 3 to 4 where the pelvis starts moving or the core starts moving towards the ball. So I'd want you to feel like you're pushing down aggressively on the handle with pressure point 2, which is the pad of the lead hand. So really feel like you're going to push down actively and aggressively on the handle here as you take the club away, continuously pushing down, and that would be the mechanism to get you to P2. As you push down with the lead hand and the pad of the lead hand on the grip, you'll find that this shoulder starts to lower, and that possibly the knee change in flexing the knees reduces a little bit. I'm not, when I say I'm not a fan of Max P2, it's obviously it's a great swing, but it wouldn't be my preferred model for most players because he does keep a little bit forward bend in the 1 to 2. That was his want at the time. But certainly the way he loads accumulator 2, he wants it fully loaded by P2 with very little travel of the lead arm. So you're going to feel like from P1 to P2, you're simply pushing down aggressively on the butt of the club with the pad of the lead hand, and what you'll find is by about here now, the shaft will start to get to parallel. The shoulder will have worked down, and you'll be relying much less on this trail shoulder lifting and trail leg straightening to get the club to P2. If we then move on, let's just get rid of a few of these lines for us, to P4-ish, and again we can see by the time we get to P3, minimal amount of load going in the wrists. As we get to the top of the backswing, obviously you can see that the glove is starting to come out from under the arm. So pressure point 5 needs to be maintained. However, if we relate it to accumulator 4, so as you lift and lose pressure point 5, accumulator 4 runs out more and travels further. Now, if you limit a player's loading of accumulator 4 whilst asking him to still send the ball its normal distance, you start to see an increased loading of accumulator 2. So a little bit of time obviously the feel that I've just given you there for P1 to P2. But what I'd also like to see you do is spend some time limiting the amount that you can get accumulator 4 to travel. So if you're practicing this indoors with a monitor, a great exercise is to put a bar in place that prevents you going past 3.5, but try and hit the ball its normal yardage. So just make your normal swing, establish some baseline yardages, and then once you do that, then limit the travel of accumulator 4 and try and hit the ball the same distance, and you'll start to see an increased use of accumulator 2. That'll start to happen incrementally. It won't just kick in from P2 onwards. So that's a good exercise again for you, because it's going to encourage a little bit more active loading of accumulator 2, relying less on accumulator 4 and 1 to get the club far enough to hit the ball far enough to get the job done. So certainly limit accumulator 4. In regards to the movement of the core towards the ball, it's certainly happening from around about 2.5 now onwards. And I mentioned before, I put that green line on there at P1. Your setup's really good, and this is not a massive tweak. It's more of a balance issue. We watch the right knee drives a little bit past where it was at P1, but I would never call you someone who drives the right knee excessively. You know, you see some guys who are driving the right knee straight at the golf ball, can't rotate through the shot, the exit's high, it's out of control. You don't tend to do that. If you look at the position of your knee, back of the trail arm, at that point, and we compare it to, I'm just going to get the other swing up now on the left hand side, or the setup should I say, and we compare it to where they were at P1. It's almost like we've gone looking for a slightly more balanced position. So the centre, the lower centre's driving forward, the knee's moving towards that line. You've got to be careful at setup that you don't, I mean, you don't particularly reach for the golf ball as such, but sometimes you can lean in with the chest versus establish the angles that you actually need. I think there's possibly a little bit of that going on with you. So I'd look to line up the back of the trail arm and the knees a little bit more, as we see here when we look at the swing at P7, and we come into P7. Back of the trail arm and the knees sort of aligned over the front portion of the foot. And at the moment we've just got the knees a little bit back of that. It's a very subtle one. I'd be interested to see how this pans out, because like I say, it is quite unusual. You're someone whose lower centre moves towards the golf ball, but whose right knee is pretty well conditioned and moves in a nice manner. And certainly the head doesn't really come away from the wall. If anything, it flexes down a little bit. So it's a little bit of an unusual one. I'd like to keep my eye on it and just see how it changes based on the advice I've given you there at P1. In regards to anything else, if you've got any questions you want to fire them across, feel free to do so. But it's a tidying up process from P1 to P2, controlling the rate at which you load accumulator 4, which will encourage a better loading of accumulator 2, and then just some little balance issues, in my opinion, on the way down and the way the lower centre moves in relation to the backside line, if you will, or the tush line as the Americans call it. Okay, hope you're well, have a great Christmas, and look forward to meeting up with you in the new year.